best nightmare hall ever! Pinkie Pie bounced towards the festival games of Nightmare Night, her sea ponytail swinging behind her and smacking unsuspecting ponies in her wake. Pinkie's candy bag bulged, threatening to burst at the seams from the weight of the sugary confections it carried. She was heading towards Applejack, who was packing up her family's traditional apple bobbing booth. Applejack couldn't help but chuckle at Pinkie's enthusiasm, pushing back the hat of her train engineer costume. Glad you had fun, and congratulations on the Oogie Boogie blocks. I heard ponies talking about how it was as much fun they had in that part of town. Applejack put her hooves on the apple bobbing trough and tipped it over, pouring out its water into a nearby storm drain. I know, and it was so much fun. Oh, and look what I got out of it! Pinkie Pie's hoof dove into her candy bag. She rummaged around inside of it for a few moments before pulling out a king-sized candy bar. Isn't it the biggest hunk of chocolate you've ever seen? Well, I don't know about that, but it is pretty big, Applejack said as she set the trough back down on its bottom. She then smiled and waved at a pony coming up behind Pinkie. Better late than never, I suppose. Right, Rarity? Rarity sighed as she came to a stop beside her friends, wearing the costume she had finally brought to her lofty standards. She had chosen to go as a mad scientist who would bring true fashion to the world. But that meant making a lab coat fashionable, a task that had proven challenging since the lab coat kept ending up looking like just a regular coat when made fashionable. The final bit of inspiration that had made the coat presentable was to cut it short on the bottom and combine it with long boots. Black boots on her back legs and purple on her forelegs that reached up to a guskin and knee, respectively. After finally finishing it, I couldn't just let it hang in the closet like all the others, Rarity said, giving a mall twirl so at least Applejack and Pinkie Pie would be able to appreciate the whole design. I don't understand why you don't just wear one of the old costumes you made, Applejack said as she pulled the empty bobbing trough through the back of a nearby cart. Not like anybody's seen them anyway. Rarity huffed. Applejack, as a mayor of fashion, I could never wear an outfit I made a previous year. It would just be unfashionable, Pinkie Pie answered with a dramatic gasp, briefly putting her forehoof against her head. No, it would be, Rarity began, only to blink and look to Pinkie, bewildered. Actually, yes, that is correct. Pinkie smiled, like a student complimented for giving the right answer from a teacher. She then dove her nose into her bag of candy, rooting around inside as empty candy wrappers dropped to the ground. Well, maybe you'll have better luck next year, Applejack said. Still, while you're here, mind helping me load the stuff into my cart? There's no time for that. Rarity, Pinkie Pie, and Applejack looked skyward and stepped to the side in the nick of time. Rainbow Dash came in fast, barely slowing down as she put her hooves on the ground and skidded to a stop. It was a landing fitting of her costume, a jumpsuit of the one worn by legendary stuntmare Daredevil. We need to the library now! Why? What's wrong? Applejack asked, lines of concern already forming on her brow. Something's happened to Twilight. Everyone in the castle vanished? 5 voices chimed in unison. Spike could only nod his head as he hurriedly climbed the ladder, his eyes searching the shelves of the library. All 5 of Twilight's friends were looking up at him from the floor, each unable to believe what they had just heard. That's what the letter from Shining Armor said. But how could this happen? Rarity asked. I don't know, Spike said, taking a book from the shelf. He turned around on the library ladder, using his tail to keep himself balanced while cracking the book open in his claws. He said that he'd explain more of what happened when we got there. He's sending us the fastest Pegasi he can with the royal chariot to pick you up. Applejack snorted, stomping a hoof. He must have been in Discord. He's up to his old tricks again. Probably booby-trapped the party where the princesses had him decorating. No, he wouldn't do something like this, Fluttershy protested, her voice taking on a rare tone of certainty. Rarity put a hoof on Fluttershy's shoulder. Not to cast doubt on him, Fluttershy, but who else do we know that could make every pony in the castle just disappear? I doubt the princesses even have the magic necessary to pull off such a feat. If Twilight estimates on Princess Celestia and Luna's magic levels are all correct, they're far from it, Spike said. He descended the ladder with the chosen book he tucked under his arm. Twilight was estimating how much magic power the princesses have. Spike nodded his head as he reached the bottom of the ladder. She was paranoid that the princesses would want to take a vacation someday and ask her to control the sun and moon in her absence. I told her it probably wouldn't happen, but she wanted to do the estimates anyway. He set the book down on the resting table nearby before climbing back up the ladder to find another. Still, that only proves my point, Fluttershy, Rarity said. Who else but Discord would be responsible? Well, I didn't say that. Spike grabbed the library shelf, using it to push himself and the wheeled library ladder to the right. Rainbow Dash flew up next to Spike, hovering over his shoulder as he drug his claw along the spines of the books. What do you mean? Did Shining Armor suspect it was someone else? He sent something with his ladder. Something he and the guards found in the bottom of Philomena's cage. It's a magic rune. A magic spoon? Oh, does it make cereal taste super yummy? Pinkie Pie asked. She bounced up beside Spike's ladder, and now held the base with her forehooves as her eyes glistened with anticipation. Not spoon, rune, Spike corrected. It's a kind of magic picture, like a recipe for a spell. He took another book off the shelf and descended the ladder before holding the book open for the mares to see. There was a cleanly drawn illustration, a circle with squiggly words and lines crisscrossing the center. Here, see this? This is a magic rune designed to freeze water. If you put magic into it, it'll make the spell actually happen. Huh. I didn't know things like this actually existed, Applejack said. It's a very old form of magic, Rarity said. It's not been practiced in a long time because of how complex the diagrams have to be and how dangerous they are. If there's a flaw in the rune, or if it gets damaged, then the spell can backfire with unpredictable results. Rarity glanced away from the book, noticing that all her friends were suddenly staring at her. What? My life may be devoted to fashion, but I am also a unicorn. It'd be going against my nature if I didn't take a few classes in magic. After all, don't Pegasi take flying classes? And don't Earth ponies take... Rarity fell silent as she motioned towards Applejack and Pinkie Pie. She then coughed, politely backing away from the hole she had almost verbally stepped into. Anyway, they found a spell rune on the bottom of Philomena's cage. Spike nodded as he closed the book and set it on top of the first tome he had pulled from the shelf. He sent it along with his letter. He's contacting some professors from Celestia's School for Gifted Unicorns to help figure out what the rune was designed to do. But he sent it along here so I could try and help as well. As Shining said in the letter, the fact that they found this in Philomena's cage could mean that someone planned this in advance. He also... Spike hesitated, wringing his claws a moment before he looked back at the mares. He's also afraid that the only pony who could possibly put something in Philomena's cage is an inside job. Rainbow Dash wrung her forehooves and shook her head firmly. What? No way. There's no way anyone would betray the princesses like that. Unless it was some pony who wasn't a pony, Applejack said plainly, her brow furrowed as she looked to her friends. We all know at least one big bug who's got a knack for crawling in and hiding where she isn't wanted. Heavens, is it possible she's behind this? Rarity asked, glancing around as if she would see changelings crawling on the walls like insects they were. Is that why Shining wants us in Canterlot? No, the reason he wants you all there is he thinks you can help find every pony. Spike walked to Twilight's writing desk, digging around in one of the drawers before pulling out a key. He then went over to the magically protected display case which contained the elements of harmony. He was wearing her crown with the element of magic when she disappeared, and Shining thinks she might be able to use your necklaces to help find her. Can they even work without the element of magic? Fluttershy asked as Spike gave each mare their respective necklace. I don't know. Last time we tried to use them with a mare down was when Discord was causing trouble, and Twilight made me the new Rainbow Dash. Spike saved Rarity's necklace for last, helping her put it on while she used her magic to hold her mane out of the way. But this is different. So, maybe we'll get lucky. Makes sense to me, Applejack said. The elements of harmony are connected, just like we are to Twilight. Why, I reckon these little stones want to be reunited with the one Twilight's crown, just as badly as we want to be reunited with her. We'll just have to show them the way. And even if they don't work, we can help Shining search the area and counterlight. Rainbow flew to the door, pulling it open and looking expectantly outside. We aren't going to rest 1 second till Twilight, the princesses, and every pony else is found. Now, where's that chariot? If they're the fastest Pegasi Shining could find, they should be here by now. Twilight woke to a ringing in her ears. When had she set an alarm clock? Why? It was the day after Nightmare Night. She was going to sleep in. She groaned, feeling something sticky on the side of her head. Candy in the bed. She should never eat candy in the bed. Now she'd have to wash all the sheets. But first she had to shut off the alarm clock. The ringing was too much. Lifting a hoof, Twilight felt around for the clock. She rolled onto her back, knowing she usually liked to sleep facing the window when she was on her side. She kept feeling, trying to find the alarm clock, though the ringing was too quiet for her alarm clock. Maybe it was an egg timer in the kitchen. Ike, Twilight mumbled, trying to feel her way around her bed. Maybe she hadn't fallen asleep on her bed. It felt hard. Maybe it was a pile of books. It wouldn't be the first time she had slept on a bed of hardbacks. Whatever you're cooking, it's done. Shut off the timer. Finally, Twilight cracked her eyes open. Instinctively, she winced, trying to protect her vision from the glare of the sun through the window. But there was no glare. She opened her eyes further, seeing the cold stone walls of the corridor. She shifted, trying to sit up and feel the sharp edges of the shattered glass beneath her. The ringing in her ears ground at her mind, but slowly her thoughts fought through each noise. She began to remember the fire consuming the maze, Philomena streaking the sky. Each piece began to fall into line as Twilight pulled herself off the floor. She turned back and saw the small puddle of congealed blood, of her blood, amongst the shard of glass. She could feel the cuts, the stickiness in her hair, which she thought had been candy in the bed. It was a head wound that had swollen into a lump. Twilight used a hoof to feel its shape, wincing at each ginger touch. It felt like she had sprouted another horn behind her ear. Where am I? Twilight asked of the darkness. She went to the window she had crashed through and looked out into the maze. She wanted to see what had happened, see what remained, but the night was too dark. It was darker than she remembered it being. She used to be able to see the maze from the castle, but now it was nothing more than an inky blackness. Maybe she was on the dark side of the castle, away from the moon. Maybe the moon had moved. Maybe there was a thick layer of clouds blocking the sky. No matter the explanation, the darkness looked wrong to Twilight, for a reason she could not explain. It made a tightness form in her stomach, like she was being gripped there, as if something had sunk its claws into her. It felt like she was running out of time. Moving away from the broken window, Twilight took a few steps down the hall of the window's neighbor. She conjured a light spell and looked at the reflection in the glass. Twilight looked like she had been tromping through the forest, a prickly forest with nasty branches that snagged and cut her up. Her mane was still done up like Celestia's, though now it was dotted with bits of rubble and glass. And her crown. Where was her crown? Twilight looked back to the layer of broken glass that had been her bed a moment later, and a moment of panic left as quickly as it came. She reached out with her levitation spell, the shimmering grip of her magic levitating her crown off the floor. She found so much solace in it. She held it before her face, looking into the element of magic that sat perfectly mounted onto the metal. She picked a few bits of glass out of her mane before setting the crown back on her head. It hurt, a little, The crown was rubbing against the lump behind her ear, but its weight against her brow was comforting. It was her element, and it represented the bond she had with her friends, a bond that gave her strength, no matter how far away from them she was. Just one more twilight, she said to herself. One more light, and Discord's game will be over. I just have to keep looking. She took a step forward, igniting the nearby hallway lights with her magic as she walked down the hall. I can do this. I can do this. Twilight faltered in her steps. She winced, bit her lip, and took the weight off of one of her hooves. Her magic enveloped her leg for a moment. Then she winced again before moving a grain of glass that had remained wedged into one of her wounds. Ow. With a whimper, Twilight poked her head out from behind the edge of a doorframe, looking into the room beyond. The hallway she had landed in was more like an enclosed patio. It separated the neighboring rooms from castle exterior walls, providing a place to enjoy sunlight and act as a connection between those said rooms. The corridor, however, didn't connect with the rest of the castle's hallways. The only way for Twilight to get back, to continue her search, was to go through one of the adjoining rooms. She had tried to do just that. She had gone to the nearest door and opened it, only to find the door opened into a stone brick wall. It was like the room beyond had disappeared from existence, or that the doors themselves were just meant as decoration. Twilight had even tried blasting her way through, but getting through one layer of bricks only revealed another layer underneath. Only one door was more than just decoration. On the exterior, the door had been unassuming. Simple wood with a single sign nailed in the front. A word had been cut into the sign. Little flakes of red in the grooves of the word's letters were evidence the sign had once been painted, but without the color, the plaque was clearly legible. The word infirmary had stood out, making a smile crawl onto Twilight's face as a flicker of hope sprang to life inside of her. Though any medicines might be expired, there was a chance she could find clean bandages to cover her cuts that she had gotten from crashing through the window. But upon opening the door, Twilight was met with a sight that sent chills down her spine. It made her heart sink while her stomach tried to force itself and all of its content up through her throat in a single upheaval. The room beyond was like a house of mirrors that had been assembled from centuries' worth of yard sales. Mirrors of every shape and size lined the walls. Mountains of mirrors stretched from floor to ceiling, leaving only a few narrow paths that led into the depths of the room beyond. It was like someone was trying to create some craggy landscape, like the mountain ranges beyond Equestria's borders, using nothing but mirrors. For a moment, Luna's rules rang out in Twilight's head. Rule 3. She was supposed to smash any mirrors she found, but Luna couldn't expect her to break all of these. That would take too long, and who knows what might hear. She knew at the very least that Celestia still stalked the hallways, and who knew what else waited in the dark. That thought led to another, one that bullied all the others out of Twilight's mind. All the mirrors were a sign of something. She hoped that there was another explanation for it. Maybe Luna had done this, gathered all the mirrors and putting them into a single room. Maybe it had been Discord himself, keeping a storehouse of mirrors ready to replace those that were broken. The simplest answer, however, was the one that Twilight dreaded the most. Like the royal bath chamber or the maze outside, the chance, a good chance, it was almost a certainty that something stalked the valleys between the mountains of mirrors. There was something in this room, and for a moment Twilight contemplated her other options. She could just break another window in the hallway, blast it out with magic. She could then fly out and back to the front entrance. That route would ensure she'd never have to know what lurked in the room. But another thought crossed her mind, making Twilight frown as she saw her silhouette reflected in the few mirrors that happened to be facing the doorway. This was like the bath chamber and the hedge maze, and there was a chance the final light was inside. She couldn't see it, as she had been able to see the others, but this was Discord's game, wasn't it? The light was in this room, and if she snuffed it out, the game would finally be over. It would all finally be over. Okay, Twilight, you can do this, she said to herself, taking her first cautious step into the room. Everything was peaceful and calm. Nothing seemed ready to leap out at her, but then again, that's how it always started. There would be nothing, and then, the moment she got close to the light, Whatever was guarding it would make its move. It was a strange security blanket. When Twilight thought about it further, there was nothing to fear until she found the light. Still, her nerves continued to grow as she walked the valleys between the mountains of mirrors. There was a heavy smell of dust in the air. Though she caught whiffs of other strange odors, they would disappear as fast as they came. But it was never the same smell twice. Sometimes they were sweet. Other times it was rotten. Sometimes it was like sniffing a flower. Others were like sniffing the Cake's twins' dirty diapers. But perhaps the worst part was the mirror themselves. They reflected the light of her horn, playing tricks on her eyes. Sometimes she would be blinded by a mirror that bounced her light back into her eyes. Other times it would be movement in the periphery of her vision, a twitch of something that would make Twilight snap her head to one side, only to realize it was only her reflection. Like the corridor of ice, the mountains of mirrors seemed to expand further than they should have been physically possible. Twilight lost sight of the walls, and the mountains of mirrors grew, pushing away the ceiling until it too faded into darkness. It was like the doorway had been a portal to another world, a world far different from the Equestria she knew and cared for. Twilight couldn't say how long she'd been wandering the paths of the foreign, reflective landscape before she saw the glow of something in the mirrors. She saw it in the distance, a few piles of mirrors that were lit up from one side. For a moment, Twilight believed it could possibly be the third and final light she needed to snuff, but it didn't fit. The previous two lights had been candles. What she had seen was coming from something larger, something brighter. The closer Twilight drew, the more she was able to make it out. A few glimpses of mirrors showed her a campfire and pedestals. She saw an open basin amidst mountains, an equine figure watching back and forth. For a brief moment, she thought it might be Princess Luna, but that didn't make any sense. Princess Luna was asleep in that guest room. As Twilight understood the rules, Princess Luna was trying to put off the transformation that had befallen Princess Celestia, Cadance, and Philomena. The odd smells that grew in the air became more frequent, and began to remind Twilight of the time she had been to Zecora's hut, when the zebra was making a potion. It was the smell of ingredients being opened, prepared, and eventually added to the brew. For a moment, Twilight had hoped that, perhaps, it was Zecora, that she had found a friendly face that would help her snuff out the last light. But Zecora wasn't at the castle's Nightmare Night party. If Twilight did come across her, it would be a sign that Discord's game had stretched further, perhaps encompassing the entirety of Equestria. Only one final bend in the path separated Twilight from the basin amidst the mountains, and she slowed down as she drew closer. She took steps with caution, raising and lowering only one hoof at a time as she inched herself closer. The bits and pieces she had only seen reflected in mirrors came together. The fire was at the center, sitting beneath a cauldron that bubbled and boiled with a sickly green brew. The pedestals were piles of mismatched mirrors that dotted the rim of the basin, each one paired with a larger, freestanding mirror. But a detail Twilight had not seen before were these shrunken heads. Each pedestal displayed a shrunken pony head, no larger than her hoof. Each had its lips and eyes sewn shut by orange-toned thread. Some didn't even have pedestals, hanging from sticks and strings attached to large standing mirrors. It was grotesque, especially since Twilight recognized a few ponies from the party. Though they were also ponies she had seen in other parts of the castle, alive and well. How could they be in two places at once? Were these just reproductions, or were the ponies she had seen alive been illusions? Twilight didn't know, and perhaps that was worse than knowing for sure. For the shrunken head nearest to her looked dreadfully familiar. White fur with a mane that was the original her current style was trying to mimic. It looked like Princess Celestia's head, and Twilight's fears were confirmed when she stepped close enough to read the wooden plaque hung haphazardly from the pedestal. It was Celestia, her eyes sewn shut, staring into a mirror that didn't show a true reflection of the things around it. Instead, the image reflected in the glassy surface was the princess silently screaming. She was bound in chains, unable to escape, as a hand, rimmed in red, reached out to her from the darkness. It stretched towards her forehead, inching closer but never reaching the princess. Twilight watched with horrified eyes, fighting every urge to rush forward and try to help. The situation was similar to every shrunken head. The mirrors reflected back the pony's head that it belonged to, each one trapped in twisted scenes being played on an endless loop. One showed a pony being chased endlessly by a pack of black dogs through the streets of the city, each dog foaming at the mouth. Another showed a pony with a noose around her neck as she stood in front of a crowd of ponies, a microphone before her mouth and note cards scattered at her hooves. Dozens of silent horror shows, each one as unique as the shrunken heads themselves. So silent was the scene, the interruption of hoot steps made every muscle of Twilight's body tense. She looked to one side, eyes searching for the source of the sound. At first she could only see the cauldron, but then a figure loomed behind it, coming from the far side of the basin. The equine figure stepped into the light of the fire. The pony's coat was like dark, dying embers, and the tatters of what looked like a sweater vest clung to his chest. From the gangly remains of his orange mane and tail hung more shrunken heads. They clattered against one another, like leaf-filled paper bags. The sound would not have been audible at such a distance if there weren't so many of them. Bits of feathers, body paint, and a bone necklace completed the look. Witch Doctor was the only title Twilight could give the pony. To the pony that lacked a head of his own. "Headless horse," Twilight whispered, watching from her spot at the edge of the basin. The witch doctor tossed something into the cauldron, causing its contents to froth and boil over. The liquid sizzled as it seeped down the sides of the scalding hot metal. He then moved to one pedestal of mirrors, the only one lacking a head. The headless horse adjusted the straightened plaque for the pedestal, then began walking to the rest. Like a clock spring being wound, the grip of panic tightened on Twilight's body as the headless pony drew closer. All the versions of the headless horse that Twilight had heard ran through her mind. While the facts varied, one thing remained constant. He took your head. Immediately, Twilight's imagination ran away with her. She saw her own shrunken head on the last remaining pedestal. What her mirror would show her she couldn't say, but that didn't seem to matter compared to the prospect of being headless. Instinct told Twilight to run, to turn and flee down the path that had brought her to the witch doctor's lair. But one thing held her hooves to the ground. There was only one light left to snuff, and it had to be here. Where else would it be but here, being guarded by such a gruesome creature? She had to find it. If she found the light and snuffed it out before the headless horse noticed her, then she could end Discord's game. Yet there was no light to be seen. There was no glimmer in the mirrors and no glow in the distance. There was just the cauldron's fire, and that didn't make sense. All of the lights were candles. She wouldn't need to try and put out a campfire, would she? It wasn't beyond Discord to play around with his rules. The time he brainwashed her friends in the maze came to mind as an example. The rhyming riddle he gave never said the lights would be candles. The headless horse was now just a few steps away, and Twilight heard her heart pumping in her ears. She sucked in a breath as every fiber of her being prepared to run. The witch doctor was getting ready to lunge at her at any moment. She needed a plan. She needed to jump away when he attacked, needed to take off and fly around. Yes, she could do that, then try to get to the cauldron. She'd overturn it with her magic and douse the fire with the brew, unless the brew was flammable. If it was, then turning it over might set the whole place on fire. She already escaped one flaming death trap. She didn't need to push her luck with a second. But then, what could she do? A wind spell would blow the fire out. But what if she just tried to smolder it? Would the headless horse be able to stop her? No matter the plan, Twilight waited for the headless horse to make the first move. It was right beside her now, with the menacing stature of a horse. Twilight's head barely reached shoulder blades. Any moment now, the creature would pounce on her. She knew it. He took another step. Twilight shook in her hooves. When was he going to attack? He was right there. He could just tackle her before she could get away. Why hadn't she taken off already? The witch doctor took another step, then another, continuing his patrol without pause. Twilight turned her neck very slowly, her mind racing. Why hadn't he attacked? Hadn't he attacked? Hadn't he seen her? Her eyes drifted to the stump of a neck, He couldn't see her. Could he? No eyes. Relief washed over Twilight like a warm water from a shower head on a cold morning. She exhaled, even laughing a bit, as the air passed her lips. That was when the headless horse stopped dead in his tracks. The many sunken heads hanging from his tail and mane twisted to face Twilight. Their ears were turned forward, and after a moment's hesitation, the headless horse himself turned and stomped towards her. Twilight sucked in another deep breath, as if trying to recapture the relieved laugh she had let escape. Then she held it, taking a few steps back as the headless horse brought himself within inches of her nose. The ears of the shrunken heads pivoted, searching for any sound. Second after second crawled while the headless horse loomed over Twilight. Her lungs began to burn and her body began to rebel. Her diaphragm shoved at the air in her lungs, trying to expel it from her body like her stomach would vomit food. Her cheeks puffed and she choked on the held breath that was spoiling inside her. Still, the headless horse stood before her, silent and still as a statue as the ears of the shrunken heads searched for her. The world began to dim to Twilight's eyes from lack of breathing, her body nearing the brink of either taking a breath or passing out. It was then that the headless horse finally turned, stepping away and returning to his patrol. Twilight's eyes followed the witch doctor as he walked away, her body holding on for a final few moments until the headless horse was once more on the far side of the cauldron. Only then did she dare to breathe. She exhaled the air that had been trapped inside of her lungs and greedily sucked in a fresh breath. Retreating from the edge of the basin as quietly as possible, Twilight hid behind the bend in the path as she waited for her breathing to return to normal. That had been too close. She leaned her back against the nearest pile of mirrors, her eyes wandering to one mirror at the far side of the path. It was turned just at the right angle, letting her see the headless horse's lair as he continued his patrol, passing by each of the shrunken heads. The headless witch doctor was blind. He had no eyes of his own to see and no ears of his own to listen. Somehow he was able to listen with the ears of the shrunken heads, but with their eyes sewn shut, the heads could not see for him. That gave her an advantage. The last light had to be the fire beneath the cauldron. If she could extinguish it, the game would be over. Smiling, Twilight called on her magic. It was a bit far away, but even from where she sat, she could reach the fire. Her magic formed a barrier around it, an airtight seal. Slowly, the flames began to die. Twilight smiled as she watched the fire smother itself with its own smoke. Then there was a triumph. After a few final flickers, the fire was out, and the mountain of mirrors were plunged into darkness. Twilight smiled and laid back. It was over. She had won. Soon everything would go back to normal. Discord would pop in, perhaps curse at his failure, but he'd honor the game. She had to believe he would. He'd honor it, and everything would go back to normal. Cadance, Philomena, and Princess Celestia would go back to normal. It'd be okay. But Twilight stared into the darkness, waiting to see or feel something change. But there was nothing. She didn't hear Discord's voice or the sound of him snapping his claw. The cold surface of the mirror she rested her back on remained the same. The smell of the pungent potion ingredients lingered in the air. It all stayed the same. Nothing changed. The game wasn't over. The campfire had not been the final light. Twilight climbed back to her hooves. Her triumphant smile fell into a deep frown. Her eyes searched the darkness around her for something. She brought a hoof to her head, as if she might reach into her brain and find the fact that she had missed. If that wasn't the final light, then where was it? It had to be here. Why else would there be a creature like the Headless Horse? Was this a red herring meant to put her off the trail? Then Discord would have known she would come to this room? Had he planned on her getting caught in Philomena's explosion? Twilight trembled, looking over her shoulder as if to expect Discord's eyes looking at her from the dark, silently laughing at her the only way his eyes could. She had been playing into his game the whole time? Well, that couldn't be, could it? She knew better than to be tricked like this. Discord had gotten her once with his riddle when she thought the elements were in the hedge maze at Canterlot Castle. She was sure she had understood it correctly this time. The clack of stone against metal reached Twilight's ears, and light began to return to the reflective halls. The Headless Horse had relit the fire, and had already returned to his patrol of the shrunken heads. It must have been important for the potion, though. Twilight could not tell what purpose the brew held. Perhaps it was how he shrank heads. Or perhaps it was the potion that caused the horrific silent visions to dance in the mirrors in front of the heads. No matter what, Twilight had lost the one reason to stay in the Headless Horse's lair. There was no light here to snuff. So she turned and snuck quietly back into the darkness of the mountain of mirrors, retracing the path back to the hallway, where she would use her first plan. She would break a window, fly outside, and get back to the front of the entrance of the castle. Twilight looked on into the lair of the Headless Horse, who was still patrolling the shrunken heads. It was hard to say how long she was gone. Her sense of time was fading like smoke in the air. She knew it had been a long while, though. Her legs were sore and her eyes heavy. She had been walking for so long, trying to find her way back to the hallway where she had crashed. But she had been able to find the way. The path between the hills were a maze on their own. The mirrors made for poor landmarks, and the strange effects of the darkness on the castle plagued her as well. She had tried breaking the mirrors to mark her path, but like the candles and torches in the corridors, things reverted back to the previous state when she got too far away. She had no evidence to prove it, but she was sure she'd been walking in circles. Circles that had brought her back time and again to the lair of the Headless Witch Doctor. There was only one hope, Twilight saw. The Headless Horse had come into his lair from the other side, when she had first discovered the basin amidst the mountain of mirrors. There had to be a path on the far side, a path that might lead her out of the room and to the rest of the castle. But to get there, she had to cross the Headless Horse's lair. Twilight stood back a few ginger steps from the edge of the Headless Horseman's patrol route, complimenting her opinions. The simplest thing would be to fly over. Yes, just glide through the air, well above the reach of the Headless Horse, and land once she was out of earshot. She wouldn't have to worry about the Headless Horse hearing her. Even if he managed to pick up on the sound of her wings, he didn't pose the same threat as Philomena had. The Headless Horse had no wings. Twilight flexed the muscles in her wings, extending them from her body in preparation of the simplest, straightforward, foolproof plan. Ah! The stab of pain from her wing hit Twilight hard, and she was able to quiet her voice before the yelp escaped. The Headless Horse hesitated only a moment before he came galloping at her, hooves like thunder against the floor. He was like a force of nature, and in her panic, Twilight could only think of one thing to do. She called on her magic, blinking away just before the Headless Horse could trample her. She reappeared a few feet back, landing on one of the towering piles of mirrors. Her hooves scrambled, trying to get a grip until she managed to grasp the top of a long, full-body mirror. She held tight, belly pressed against the surface as her legs dangled back. She was not far from the safe level ground. She would just have to slide a few inches down the mirror to be back on her hooves. But Twilight didn't dare move as her eyes remained locked on the Headless Horse. The monstrous Equian was standing exactly where she had been, hooves shifting anxiously as the ears of the shrunken heads twitched and turned in every direction. Twilight didn't even dare to breathe as she watched, waited, and mentally begged the Headless Horse would not hear her. Please don't come closer, she thought to herself. Don't turn me into a shrunken head. For several torturous seconds, the Headless Horse remained resolute, not moving an inch as his shrunken head searched for any sounds. But he finally turned away, returning to the patrol he maintained like it was an unforsakable duty. Twilight let herself breathe again when he turned away, sliding down the mirror and putting her hooves back on solid ground. She then looked to her wing, carefully extending it. It had been sore, like much of her body. After enduring an explosion and a crash landing through the window, Twilight was thankful that she wasn't in worse condition. She had not, however, noticed how injured one of her wings was. The joint was swollen. When it was folded against her side, it wasn't bad. It just ached a little. Extending it, however, sent a bolt of pain shooting through her nervous system to stab at the core of her brain. Flying wasn't an option anymore. Gingerly tucking her wing back against her side, Twilight looked at the Headless Horseman. He was still walking on the edge of his lair, his path still passing by each pedestal and its accompanying shrunken head. His pace was constant and controlled. The steady rhythm of his hoof steps was like the reliable clicking of a metronome. She still needed to get across to the far side of the Headless's Witch Doctor's lair. She had to get the other path and hope it would lead her out to the mirrored mountains. but she couldn't fly, and once more teleportation felt like a risk. She could not see the path on the far side. Her view was blocked by the cauldron, and her teleportation spell was not silent. There would be sound when she disappeared and another when she reappeared. She had lucked out with her previous teleportation. The galloping of the headless horse's hooves had masked the sound of her blinking back into reality. She could not count on being that lucky a second time. There was only one way across. It was possible. All she had to do was ensure that the headless horse did not notice her. So Twilight began a single, tentative step. As if creeping across a creaky floor, she gingerly tip-hoofed into the lair of the headless horse. She watched the witch doctor intently. With each step he took, Twilight tried to take one of her own. It was difficult. With the difference in their heights, the headless horse took much longer strides than Twilight could manage silently. She had to take steps when she could, sometimes waiting for the witch doctor to take 5 or 6 strides before finally making another move of her own. It was an excruciating experience. She never had to think so much about the mechanics of walking. She had to control every muscle with such precision to ensure that the sound of her step was minimalized. A gnawing headache began to form in the base of her horn, and the aches of the pains in her body magnified from the strain. But through it all, her plan was working. The headless horse had not noticed her, and she had reached the halfway point. She stood next to his bubbling cauldron, the pungent smell of the ingredients mixing to form a coordinated attack against her nose. The few sweet smells she had caught on the wind when approaching the doctor's lair were washed away by the odors of rot and decay. The smell alone made Twilight want to gag, but she forced down the urge to cough and refocused on the headless horse's. She took another step with him, synchronizing the fall of her right hoof with his back left. They touched at the same time. Any sound she made was muffled by his own hoofsteps. She was that much closer to the exit. There was only one more thing Twilight had to circumvent, before she'd have a straight shot to another path. The empty pedestal stood before her. There was no shrunken head, and its mirror attached acted as a mirror should. It reflected the surroundings as they were them and nothing more. It would take a few steps to walk around the pedestal and would give a wide berth Twilight felt necessary. But that was okay. It was just a few more steps. Everything was going well so far. She could afford to take a few more steps. One step to the right, another step to the right, and slightly forward. A third step forward, and she was already halfway past the pedestal. The path was within clear sight now, and the urge to just teleport to it was overwhelming. But Twilight stuck to her plan. She'd made no sound, raised no suspicion. The headless horse would not even know she was there. The headless horse was looping back around to Twilight's right side as she took a fourth step, turning the pedestal next to her left wing. She could now see the reflection of the mirror in the periphery of her vision. She could see the shrunken heads. Something was wrong. The mirrors, they weren't showing the horrors anymore. They were all showing the same thing. A welcoming office. There was a comfortable-looking chair and a large couch where the pony, accompanying shrunken head, belonged. She sat on, as if waiting. Twilight turned her head to the right, stopping in her tracks as her mind tried to piece together the discrepancies that she was seeing. When she looked directly at the mirrors, paired with the shrunken heads, they showed horrific scenes. They showed ponies being mauled, being chased, and otherwise tormented. But the mirror next to her, when it reflected the horrible visions of its brothers, they changed. And the headless horse changed as well. The headless horse's reflection was an ember orange pony in a festive, pumpkin-themed sweater vest. He was a pony that looked stressed and worn out. He was muttering something to himself and looking to the shrunken heads. While I tried to make out what it was saying, I could only pick out a few words from reading his lips. Ant, problems, own, doctor, rock, mountain. The headless horse stepped out of the mirror's view, and so too did the reflected pony disappear. There was a temptation in Twilight's mind to stay where she was, to wait until the headless horse made another lap and tried to read his lips once more. But Luna's note rang in her mind. It was to smash the mirrors. Why did she have to smash the mirrors? Were they part of Discord's game? Were they meant to confuse her? If that was their purpose, then they were working. In thinking of the Draconius, Twilight's eyes were drawn to the empty pedestal that accompanied the mirror. She turned her head, her mane brushing against the stack of mirrors and the plaque that had hung from one small nail. Like the other plaques, this one had been engraved with a name. 7 letters that only drove Twilight's mind to greater confusion. Discord. The pedestal beside her was meant for Discord's shrunken head, but that didn't make any sense. Discord would never let himself get caught by one of his own traps, unless it was some kind of cruel joke. Twilight expected to see the letters in the wooden morph as she watched them, to change into her name perhaps, but they remained as permanent as they could be. It was too much to process. There were too many questions that needed to be answered, but Twilight knew she couldn't stay to try and figure out where she was. She had to get away from the Headless Horse. Then she could sit down, rest, and try to make sense of everything. It was close. All she had to do was turn her head back, and the sound of the wooden plaque clattering to the floor made Twilight's heart skip a beat. Her mane, in its reproduction of Princess Celestia's hair, had brushed against the plaque. When she had turned to look at the pedestal, the slight nudge had caused no harm. But when she turned back, however, her mane caught on the edge of the plaque, tugging its corner gently. Twilight hadn't even felt it, for the result unmistakably echoed across the mirrored mountains. From behind, Twilight could already hear the thundering gallop of the Headless Horse. She leapt forward, avoiding the enraged stomp from the witch doctor by mere inches. She galloped, closing the last few feet of the Headless Horse's lair and entering the winding path that had been her goal. The Headless Horse, however, did not give up his pursuit as he had before. It was like a living earthquake, every step sending tremors through the reflective hills that bordered the path. Mirrors began to fall from the piles, crashing against the floor in explosions of shards. Twilight had to dodge left and right to avoid the rockslide of glass, metal, and wood. She stumbled and leapt. She skidded around turns and shielded herself magically against mirrors that she could not avoid. She did everything and anything she could to keep galloping. To slow down was to become another shrunken head to the Headless Witch Doctor. But a glimmer of hope shone through the darkness. The endless expanse of reflective hills was receding. The ceiling and walls of the room were coming back into view. Twilight even caught glimpses of a door in some of the mirrors. There was a way out, and she was getting closer. She just had to keep running. The burn from her lungs, the throb of her strained muscles, they had been hindrances earlier when she fled from other monstrosities in the castle. She was numb to that pain now. To be tired, sore, and alive was a million times better than what would happen to her if she was caught by something like the Headless Witch Doctor. You never wanted to be caught by the Headless Horse. No matter the form, no matter how he appeared, and no matter how you told the story, you could never let yourself get caught. If he caught you, you would never heard from again. A clatter reached Twilight's ears, rising out of the symphony of stomping hooves and falling mirrors. It was a thick thud accompanied by the scraping of metal against stone. It sounded too big and heavy to be a mirror, and soon Twilight caught a glimpse of its source. She was near the exit. A few more bends in the path and she would have been able to escape. If Princess Celestia had not just broken down the door. The Sun Princess stood in the doorway, lips still turned into a sneering smile, drool dripping to the floor as light from her horn flooded the room. She was still on the hunt, her eyes focused like those of a hungry predator. Twilight looked back over her shoulder. The Headless Horse was chasing her, and Princess Celestia was now at the exit, blocking her only way out. She was trapped, stuck between two creatures who wanted nothing more than to put an end to her existence, as either a meal or a shrunken head. What could she do? There were no offshoots on the path. She couldn't turn and run the other direction. She couldn't fly. All she had was her magic, and even that would be difficult to use. She couldn't concentrate on anything but running. Going this fast, sprinting this hard, and pushing through the pain all took mental fortitude that she could muster. She could not have been able to sustain the life from her horn spell if the spell required even a scrap of concentration. She rounded the last bend in the path. It was just a straight shot to the door, and Celestia had seen her now. The princess unleashed a gruesome roar again, her mouth and jaw stretching and unhinging like the maw of a snake. The princess began to gallop at Twilight, the thunder of her hooves mixing with the sound of the Headless Horse. They were like two trains barreling towards one another on the same track. She was stuck in the middle. Two trains on the same track with no way to avoid one another. It was her last hope, a last desperate chance, and Twilight seized it with her mind and soul. She slowed her speed, still running but not at a breakneck pace. She cleared her mind, even as the Headless Horse and Celestia drew in. One spell was all it would take. One dangerous, blind teleport. She couldn't see where she would land. If she teleported too high, she would fall and injure herself. If she sent herself too low, parts of her legs could get magically fused into the floor. Too far to the left or right, and the surrounding mirrors would become part of her anatomy. Too many risks, only one chance. And with Celestia and the Headless Horse inches away, Twilight took the leap. She blinked out of existence, disappearing moments before the Headless Horse and Princess Celestia collided. Twilight reappeared after the collision had occurred, her hooves reaching for the ground. She had been a little high. She stumbled a little, but she had performed the spell within a safe margin of error. She had done it and gladly galloped towards the open door, even if her legs felt like they were turning to jelly. She got out into the hallway that adjoined the Headless Horse's room. She then turned, calling on her magic to pick up the door that Celestia had broken down. It was then, when she was looking back, that Twilight caught the glimpse of something. Celestia was now in the throes of combat. She and the Headless Horse, duking it out there amongst the mountains of mirrors. Celestia cast magic and tried to sink her teeth into the Headless Horse, while he fought like a primitive equian, swinging his forelegs and trying to land the occasional buck. That, however, was not what drew Twilight's eyes. She was looking in the mirrors surrounding the pair, her eyes fixed on the reflections. She saw, once more, the plain, simple, ember-orange pony in a sweater vest, just as she had seen him in the mirror's reflection, back in the Headless Horse's lair. What she didn't see was Princess Celestia. No, the mirrors did not reflect Celestia's white coat. They did not reflect the princess's mane, still dyed purple to match Twilight's style. They did not reflect a sun cutie mark. No, they reflected a black coat and a starfield mane. They reflected piercing emerald eyes and a purple, splotchy cutie mark from a crescent moon. Celestia's reflection was that of Nightmare Moon, the only semblance between the two being their twisted mouths, filled with a captivity, with drool-dripping fangs. Twilight stared for several seconds, before the crash of breaking mirrors brought her back to reality. Celestia had just blasted the Headless Horse into the pile of mirrors. Perhaps it was the end of the fight. Perhaps it was just the first devastating blow of many. For Twilight, it didn't matter. She refocused her magic, hauling the door back onto its frame. She used her magic to repair the hinges and latch as best she could. She then turned and ran, trying to put as much distance between herself and that door as possible. Exhausted, hungry, and aching, Twilight leaned her body against the cold, comforting stone of the castle's corridor. She couldn't say how far she had run. She didn't know for certain if she was safe from Celestia or the Headless Horse. It didn't truly matter. She needed to stop. She needed to rest. She needed the nightmare to be over. Legs giving out beneath her, Twilight slid down until she was lying on the ground, tears spilling from her eyes. It was too much. She couldn't do it by herself. She needed help. She wanted her friends. She wanted her brother. She wanted her sister-in-law. She wanted her mother and father. She wanted the game to be over. Bringing her legs close to her body, she began to curl up into a fetal position. She grabbed her tail with her four hooves, holding it. She trembled, thinking of Celestia, Cadance, and Philomena. Had they tried to snuff the three lights as she had? What had happened to a pony if they failed? What about Luna's rules? Princess Luna had said the rules would keep her safe, but Twilight felt they had done nothing but lead her to the darkest horrors of the castle. Those rules were to keep her safe, but now she was bruised, beaten, and bloodied. She couldn't fly. She wouldn't be able to save herself if Princess Celestia found her right now. It was just over. The only comfort was the looming embrace of sleep. She wanted to sleep. She didn't want to see the end coming. She wanted to be asleep when the Headless Horse, or Celestia, or Cadance, or Philomena, or whoever finally caught up with her. It would be over quick if she was taken in her sleep. For once, she wanted to go someplace small and quiet. She gladly would pick being buried alive in a casket over this. She'd trade her bed for a stone tomb and let Spike seal her in every night like a vampire if it meant she didn't have to deal with this. She wanted to scream her plea bargain to the darkness, in hopes that it might give her the peace of solitude of the tomb. But still she feared Princess Celestia. She was afraid of her own mentor, a pony she had looked up to, as many others, would round a corner with a sneering mouth full of teeth. And this perhaps was the greatest pain. Celestia had fallen to darkness, had failed at Discord's game. What hopes did she have of succeeding? Please, any pony? Need help. Please? Twilight whimpered. She took one forehoof from her tail, rubbing at her eyes to try and clear her teary, blurred vision. And it was after that, when she opened her eyes to look again, she saw a light. It was down the hallway, coming from a room with a cracked door. There was a sound of air, scraping metal against stone. Twilight pressed herself against the wall, fearing for the worst. But nothing came from the door. It just remained cracked, light seeping in beneath its seams while the scraping sound continued. Twilight stared at the door for a long time before finally mustering the strength and courage to get her to her hooves. She walked gingerly, muscles aching from the strain they had been put through, the second guessing her decision with every step. She turned her back to the door more than once, intending to just walk away. But the light was warm, like the light in the room where Luna slept. Maybe this was where Luna was sleeping. She had just seen Celestia. She could have been back in that part of the castle. Luna's room was a sanctuary against everything, a place to be safe. She could sleep there and recover her strength. It was like finding an oasis in the desert, and Twilight wanted to believe it was real more than anything. She wanted to believe it wasn't a trap or some other sort of sick game. So she raised a hoof, placed it on the door, and pushed. The light poured out over Twilight, and she stepped into the room. It was a guest bedchamber, very similar to the one Luna slept in. The light was coming from a lantern hanging from one of the bedposts. The furniture had been shoved about, leaving a single large part of the wall exposed. One pony sat facing that wall, a royal guard of Canterlot. The mare was lost in a dream, like so many other ponies in the castle. But this mare was one Twilight recognized. This guard was a pony that she had met that fateful night, one of the few to survive the trip to the catacombs of the ancient castle. It was a guard who possessed two swords. One lay at the ground near her flank, and the other was held in the mare's teeth, being used as a tool to scratch the wall. Twin blades? Twilight said, stepping up behind the mare. She reached out a hoof, then retracted it. She didn't know what would happen if she disturbed Twin blades. She might start to change like all the other ponies Twilight had seen. But that concern fell away to others, more pressing thoughts as Twilight moved to the wall. Words had been haphazardly scratched onto the stone, all seemingly done by Twin blades and her sword. Some things were repeated ad nauseum. Mirrors, library, the 5 lights, dotted the walls at different sizes and angles. Other phrases appeared only once. Don't snuff the lights. Truths mirrored our lies. Lies mirrored our truth. Not discord. At the center of it all, scratched with the largest lettering and the deepest cuts, were 2 words. 2 words that left Twilight's jaw hanging as her mind reeled in disbelief. 2 words that brought into question everything she had done. 2 words that made other oddities she had seen seem to be more than just random occurrences. Luna lies.